While Kyle Dubas went bargain shopping for the first day of free agency, there are still deals out there left to be had. Hunter and I are going to talk about that and more on this edition of the Locked On Penguins podcast.
You're Locked On Penguins, your daily podcast on the Pittsburgh Penguins, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to another edition of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Patrick Damp. You can give me a follow on Twitter at synonym for wet. Joined as always while he is still on vacation because he's dedicated to the grind, the one and only Hunter Hodes. You can follow him on Twitter at Hunter Hodes. You can give our show's account a follow at LO_Penguins. And we thank you for making this your first listener watch of the day because we're your team every day. And don't forget that we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts as well as YouTube. Before we hit the ground running today, we have to tell you that today's episode is brought to you by Indeed. Still searching for a great candidate for your company? Don't search, just match with Indeed. Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Okay, so we are in that part of the summer now, Hunter, where things are starting to slow down. We're not getting a ton of news, but that means we get to play armchair general manager. We get to put on our backward baseball hats, turn the microphones on, and come up with some ideas that maybe if Kyle Dubas is a listener of our show, he could take some advice and do what we want. So we know that July 1st for Kyle Dubas was not the most exciting day, did not do a whole heck of a lot, got some depth pieces on short-term deals with not a lot of money handed out, which both you and I have said that's the way to go right now. There's no need to dedicate big money or term to any of these players, especially with their stated goal of wanting to compile prospects and draft picks. So the plan remains intact. So with that in mind, there are still some needs that this team has, even though they pretty much have, for all intents and purposes, a roster filled out. They have enough players to put an NHL team on the ice come October, along with several players in the American League who could potentially fight for a spot. But that doesn't mean that the work is finished. So there are two names Hunter and I want to go over today who are still available on the UFA market. And I think it'll make most of our listeners happy because they fit into that oh so requested, they need to get younger camp. So Hunter, kick us off. I know this is a name that you and I have discussed on the show before. And surprisingly, this player is still available on the unrestricted free agency market.
Right. Oliver Shillington. We've discussed him a couple of times on the show already. Someone that is really good in his own zone, can bring a little bit of offense. But the thing with Shillington is it feels like they've already, I guess, quote unquote, signed him and Matt Grzelcyk, a player who can play on the second pairing, a player that can play on the third pairing. So if you do sign Shillington, you're going to have to move someone. I don't think it's going to obviously be Erik Karlsson. It's not going to be Chris Letang. You just signed Grzelcyk. You just signed Sebastian Aho. I mean, in theory, it would maybe have to be someone like Ryan Graves, but I mean, we've talked about this a lot on the show too. Kyle Dubas said during his end-of-year press conference that this is going to be kind of the make it or break it year in terms of Ryan Graves. But still, if we could get out of that contract, I would be very much in favor of that. I mean, maybe it could mean Marcus Pettersson gets traded. I mean, we've talked about that a little bit as well, but I still think at least heading into the season, Marcus Pettersson is going to be a member of this team. So someone like Shillington, he still makes some sense, but where he slots in the lineup, at least right now, that's what I kind of question a little bit. Again, we've already dove into his underlying numbers. He's been a very underrated player throughout his time in Calgary. He would make a lot of sense here. He would come cheap, but when I look at the roster right now and I look at the amount of defensemen they have, I'm just not sure when you look at the team right now, they'll be able to fit him in unless they move someone or multiple defensemen out.
Yeah, it would definitely need to preclude another move. They would have to move on from somebody at this point because they have, at this moment, so many defensemen in their system. So you figure even without the possibility of going out and getting Oliver Shillington, that a move is probably going to happen at some point just because of the sheer numbers of it right now. So that said, I would be very happy if they could get him on a cheap deal for 1 to 2 years, just because, like you said, we've discussed his numbers. They're very good, both underlying and top of the page. And he's not going to come at some big price increase. He only made $2.5 million over the last 2 years with the average annual value. He's well outperformed it in my estimation, not by a ton, but he hasn't earned some gigantic raise. He's not looking at $5.5 million. I think at a ceiling, he's looking at 3. But if nothing else, I think he would probably get the same kind of contract he was already on before, just because of his age and because while his metrics are mostly good, those counting stats are fairly unimpressive, I would say. But at the same time, definitely a player that is worth taking a look at. Another player that
And also, just not to interrupt, just when you look at the market now, it's already been 2 weeks since July 1. His price, I feel like, is only going to go down the deeper you go into the offseason. I feel like you could get him for, again, a good steal, but it's just like, where does he fit on the roster right now overall?
And then for me, the other person that I wanted to take a look at, and I know I'll get some eye rolls on this because it's certainly a project. It's certainly not somebody who's going to move the needle one way or the other, but it's a young forward, only 24 years old, plays the right side, and there's a lot of potential there for this player, and that's Filip Zadina. He took a bet on himself, got out of his contract with the Detroit Red Wings, and it didn't really lead to a ton of success last year. He played 72 games, dealt with some injuries at the end of the season, 13 goals, 10 assists, 23 points. But again, 24 years old, he still has a lot of promise. He's a very talented forward who just hasn't put it all together yet. And then you add in the fact that he takes that chance on himself, gets out of his deal with the Detroit Red Wings, and then he goes to San Jose, a team that is actively tanking. They are actively working to get that first overall pick, which they succeeded in doing. And you look at the way he's played, the way he's been compensated, made less than $1 million, obviously, on his ELC, didn't really perform up to expectation with the Detroit Red Wings. He gets a 1-year deal. It's all of $1.825 million with Detroit, gets out of that deal. And then he goes to San Jose and has the same exact AAV. It is another player who I look at it and go, you know what? If you can get him on a cheap 1, maybe 2-year deal, if nothing else, if it doesn't work out, if it's a 2-year deal, that deal in year 2 is very easy to move for another team to take a chance on. You can recoup some assets for it. But if it works out, great. You got a guy who's not costing you a lot of money and could be effective as a middle six forward.
Right. And I mean, again, he scored 13 goals for the Sharks this past season. I mean, I would love if the Penguins had another player who could score double-digit goals for their bottom 6. I don't see Zadina as someone who can really play in the top 6. So if you're thinking of someone that can play on Sidney Crosby's left wing, you're probably going to have to aim higher. I don't think Zadina is that type of player right now in his career, even though he's a bit younger. He's at best a middle 6 guy, but I think in a perfect scenario, he can play on your 3rd or 4th line overall. His underlying numbers this past season, I got to say it, Pat, not the greatest, but he also did play on the worst team in hockey. In 72 games when he was on the ice with the Sharks, they only had 43% of the shot attempts. Also, 24 goals for, 61 goals against, 41% expected goal share, 40% of the scoring chances. His underlines, again, were just flat out brutal overall this year. But I think overall, when you look at those numbers, you do have to think about, okay, he was on the worst team in the league. I don't think his numbers are going to be this bad on a team like the Penguins, even though I don't know if the Penguins are necessarily going to make the playoffs this year. You got to think a lot of those are going to improve overall.
Right. And you look at those underlyings, and yes, they're underwater, they're under 50%, but at the same time, being close enough to 50% when you're on a team like the San Jose Sharks kind of shows me that, okay, maybe this is more a roster construction and team problem than it is an individual problem, because we know how bad the Sharks were this year. There was no secret about it. They were genuinely awful. And being able to stay moderately close to 50% when you're on a team like that tells me that there is some promise and some talent there and an ability to play well. And again, I want to make sure this is clear. I'm not talking this guy up like he's a diamond in the rough, star in the waiting. He's not. I think it's safe to say that he's a little bit of a draft bust, but there is still good hockey in front of him to be played. And if you can put him in a better situation, say here in Pittsburgh, which again, we're not talking about the Penguins as if they're a contender or a team that could win the Stanley Cup, but a team that, if nothing else, you can be an island of misfit toys for the way the Penguins are trying to operate right now. And that pretty much describes the two guys we've talked about in this segment.
Yeah, and also we've had the discussion of maybe, a couple of the players that they've already signed maybe being flipped at the deadline. The same holds true here with someone like Shillington, with someone like Zadina. If Zadina goes out there, plays really well, you could flip him at the deadline and get a pick or a prospect back. Same thing with Shillington. So that also fits the mold of them doing this quote unquote, rebuild on the fly, mini retool, whatever you want to call it. So you have to consider that as well. But I do think they would fit both these players' needs that this team still has right now. Zadina, another player that can fit in the bottom six, that can give them some more depth scoring just because they didn't have that much last year. Then Shillington, someone that can play in the top four, and honestly, someone right now who, my opinion, he's better than Matt Grzelcyk.
I would definitely agree with that as well. So we will see what Kyle Dubas does the rest of this summer, because we've still got some time to go until the team gets back to Cranberry for training camp later this summer. And that will do it for this first segment of the Locked On Penguins podcast. When Hunter and I return, we're going to discuss, because it got a little bit lost in all of the UFA draft and everything else period of time, what David Quinn needs to do to get this power play back on track. But before we do that, we have to tell you about our first sponsor, and that is Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. I've talked about it before when I've been sitting in the hosting chair. I used Indeed all those years ago when I was searching for a job, and it helped me find my current job as well as get me interviews with other potential employers. It's a great platform that does the job better than anyone else. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences, so the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibilities at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about it on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Welcome back to the Monday edition of the Locked On Penguins podcast. It's another vacation cast for one Hunter Hodes. I am Patrick Damp, and thank you as always for making us a part of your daily routine. And before we threw to break there, I said that we're going to discuss something that made us pull our proverbial hair out this past season, and that was the Penguins power play. Lost in all the shuffle of the draft, free agency, and everything else because of what a long season this past NHL season was the hiring of David Quinn. We touched on it when he was hired, but at the time, we didn't have a lot of detail on what he was going to do. We pretty much assumed, because of who he was replacing in Todd Reirden, that he would be in charge of the defense because he's got great pre-existing relationships with someone like Erik Karlsson. I don't know where I got Phil Kessel from. Guess I'm just longing for the glory days. But with Erik Karlsson and just the way he had Karlsson and Fox winning Norris trophies under his tutelage, but now we've learned that he will have input on the power play. So Hunter, I throw it to you. What does David Quinn have to do to fix this power play short of putting it in a time machine and bringing back Phil Kessel? See there, I tied it all together.
See, that's a perfect one. We got to put Kessel back on the half wall and just have the power play run through him again, right? God, that power play with him there was so meant overall to watch. But it really comes down to a few things for me when it comes to the Penguins power play. Number one, fixing the zone entries. So many times throughout the season, the Penguins, they were so bad at getting the puck in the zone. Every time they were coming from their own zone into the neutral zone and then into the offensive zone, the other team was just getting the puck and sending it back down just because they had no idea how to enter the zone with control. The controlled zone entries were awful under Todd Reirden, especially this year. David Quinn has to fix that if this power play is going to be better this year and in future years. When I look at some of the best power plays in the league, Colorado, Tampa Bay, the Rangers, they are all so great at carrying the puck in with control and setting up right away. The Penguins weren't able to do that at all this past season, and it cost them dearly. And when on the off chance they actually got into the offensive zone, it was just so stagnant. They overpassed way too much. They played patty cake, if you will. We've talked about that a few times on the show. There was no shoot first mentality. I want to see David Quinn, bring that into the fold and have these players just, again, shooting the puck a lot more. I know I make fun of the people who just yell shoot at PBG Paints Arena or just in general, but at times last season, those people were right. The Penguins were just not shooting the puck on the power play. You got to get some good looks and fire the puck to the net and just not overpass. That was something that was really annoying me. And also movement. I want these players to move around. I love Sidney Crosby in his office below the goal line. I love Evgeny Malkin in his office on the right half wall, but I want Erik Karlsson moving around. If Chris Letang's out there, I want him moving around. Heck, I even want Crosby moving around a little bit at times as well, if sometimes maybe his office below the goal line is not working at times. I also think having Michael Bunting full-time in the power play is going to pay huge dividends, a really strong net front presence that can clean up the garbage. That's what I'm really looking for in terms of how David Quinn can fix this power play for next season and at least have it be an average unit. That's kind of my expectations. Do I need it to be a top 5 unit in the league? No. Do I even need it to be top 10 in the league? No. It would be nice if there was those two things, but I don't expect that. But I expect at least league average from the amount of talent that this team could put out there on their first power play unit.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of beat me to the punch for what I was going to say about what Quinn has to do to get this power play back to even average. And for me, that is what you said, and that's movement, because this power play was so static when it got into the offensive zone after they had those struggles of whether it was the drop pass or a lack of controlled zone entry.
Get the drop pass out of here, baby, please. I never want to see that stupid drop pass as they're coming up to the red line. They drop it back. Get that, send that to hell, honestly. I never want to see that again.
Here's and this gets back to what I was starting to say about movement. I'm fine if they keep the drop pass, but it has to have everybody in the neutral zone moving in some way or another. It either has to be puck support, it has to be guys filling lanes and transitioning from side to side so that you're pulling those defenders away from you and coming to the zone with speed. The problem was, just like I was starting to say with the offensive zone setup, was that transition game was also still. They were making the drop pass, and the only two people moving were the person with possession and then the person receiving the drop pass, which that's very easy to defend if you get to a spot and stand there, and that applies to the offensive zone as well. You would see this team get into the zone, and they would get to their places, whether it was Crosby behind the net, Malkin on the right half wall, Karlsson up top, whoever was in the bumper spot. They would get to where they were going and just stay there. And as an NHL penalty killing unit, that's very, very easy to defend because your only threat is the guy in front of the net at that point. And all you have to do is just keep him out of your goalie's sight line. And if you're able to do that, everything else is easy to defend because all that power play is going to do is pass it around the perimeter and never get any looks. So like you said, and like I'm starting to say, there has to be movement. Guys have to be willing to fill in lanes. Yes, ultimately you want to get it to a point where Crosby's behind the net and making that insane goal line tip he's so known for, or Malkin on the right half wall for a one-timer, or Karlsson ready to blast away from the point with the guy who I'm with you in believing is the X factor in Michael Bunting, just wreaking absolute havoc in front of the net. So that is the biggest thing I think Quinn needs to bring to this power play. And it applies to both the offensive zone as well as the neutral zone and breakout. And that's movement. This can't be a stagnant power play. I'm not asking them to go back to their 2016 days where they try to play the game at 1,000,000 miles an hour, because they're not really capable of that anymore. But they can't just stand around and wait for everything to develop around them. They've got to move. They've got to make this their power play and make it so they're pulling defenders out of positions, leading to them getting good looks in the offensive zone.
Right. When they were just passing around the perimeter throughout this past season, the penalty killers were just kind of standing there like, okay, if you're going to do that, we'll just stand here and wait to block shots. They made it so easy on every team's penalty kill just because the penalty kill really didn't have to do anything. And you talked about the movement on the drop pass. I do understand what you're saying, just because when the only two players that are moving are the guy that makes the drop pass and the player that comes to get it, the penalty kill, those players, they can just sit at the blue line, all four of them, and just deny you a zone entry like it was happening quite a bit last season. And then they can just send it back down and then it would repeat itself. They got to find a way for everyone to be moving there and to either A, have the puck dumped in and have your players go get it, or B, have a controlled zone entry where you can set it up in, 4, 5, 6 seconds, something like that. And also, maybe this is me being a bit nitpicky, I kind of want to see the first unit out there for more than just 45 or 50 seconds. I don't need it to be, the Edmonton Oilers, for example, where McDavid and Draisaitl and them are out there for the full 2 minutes, because I don't think most power plays in the league can do that just because of how great the Oilers power play is. And yes, I should have mentioned them when I was talking about the other top power plays. I somehow missed them there for some reason, but I still want them out there for more than 45 to 50 seconds. Give me at least a minute, 65, 70, 75 seconds. And then you can have the second power play unit come out for, the final, for example, 40, 45 seconds, something like that. I just think the first unit is out there for too short of a time. And I think that also kind of screws with the power play quite a bit, just because you put the second power play out there at times for more time in the first unit when it should be the opposite.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And I do think a product of that was just because of how much it was struggling, and that Sullivan was not afraid to pull the ripcord on that first unit just because they were not producing. But I also agree, you got to give them a little bit more time to cook, to get set up, to actually try to get some looks. And that's really difficult to do in 45 to 60 seconds, especially with the way that power play was struggling. But I think that's going to do it for this second segment. When we return, we kind of sort of know who the top six is going to be at this moment going into this season. So we're going to talk about some expectations, obviously outside of the two big names, Crosby and Malkin, and what we think they're going to do this upcoming season. And we will do that right after this. All right, we're back on the Monday edition of Locked On Penguins. It's another vacation cast for the one and only Hunter Hodes. I am Patrick Damp, and as I'm apt to do, thank you always for making us part of your daily routine, joining us while we sit here and wear our backwards baseball caps and play armchair GM and armchair coach. It's just what we like to do in the summer because we're absolute sickos, and we love you for it. So, said it before we went to break. We kind of know who the top six is going to be at this point. We still believe that they got to go out and find another mythical winger for Sidney Crosby in the absence of Jake Guentzel. But right now, for all intents and purposes, that winger is Drew O'Connor. He's joined by Bryan Rust. You've got Michael Bunting, and you've got Rickard Rakell. That makes up your top six, with Crosby and Malkin being the centers. So without talking about Crosby and Malkin, because we have been talking about them quite a bit lately, let's talk about the other four guys that fill out the top six: O'Connor, Rust, Bunting, Rakell. What are our expectations for them this year? What do we think they need to do? And how does that make this team any better or worse? I know you and I have kind of hinted at it, but I'm going to start it here. I'm very concerned about having Drew O'Connor as your left wing on line one. I think he came into his own this past year. He had a very promising season. He looked not at all out of place, but we can't guarantee that this is who he's going to be. I've often referred to him as a mini Bryan Rust, a player who worked his way up through the lineup, playing pretty much every kind of role and becoming a top six winger. But We don't know if that trajectory is going to continue this year or if he's going to come back to earth. So I'm still of the mindset that I'm fine with him filling in there, but being the permanent fixture on the top line, that gives me a lot of pause.
Right. I'm right there with you. I see him as a really sound middle six to third line winger overall, 16 goals, 33 points this past season for O'Connor. I do think he's going to hit 20 goals this year. That's one of my predictions, at least my early predictions as of this time, but I still don't think he is a full-time fixture on Crosby's wing. I think if you can get someone else to play with him and then move O'Connor down to the third line where he can score 20 goals for you, I think you're doing really well overall. But in terms of who I think is going to produce the most in the top six outside of Crosby and Malkin, just because I think those are going to be the two top point producers until proven otherwise. I've been going back and forth on Michael Bunting and Bryan Rust. I mean, you look at how good Rust was this past season, 28 goals, 56 points in 62 games. He missed 20 games and still is almost a point per game player. Had he been healthy for a full season, I think he would have eclipsed 70 points. But with how great Bunting played down the stretch, he finished the season 19 goals, 55 points, 81 games. I think you're going to see Bunting have the most points out of all the wingers, at least right now, just because I loved his fit with Evgeny Malkin. They were so seamless, it felt like, together. And I do think you're going to be in store for a pretty big year from him. I'm not going to sit here and say he's going to score 30 to 35, but I could see him scoring, 23 to 25 goals, maybe having 60, 65 points. And right now, I see him as the top point producer among wingers in the top six. If I had to pick a 1B, I'd go Bryan Rust. I think if he stays healthy next season, he's going to have a very similar type of year. And after that, don't be surprised, I will say, even though I am down on Rickard Rakell, and I've talked about potentially moving him this offseason just because I don't like that contract overall, but don't be surprised if he does bounce back at least a little bit next season. Only 15 goals, 37 points in 70 games this year. He was fairly banged up throughout the season. I do think he could get back to the level that we see him score at, 21, 22 goals, maybe 50, 52 points. I would not be surprised if that happens with him.
Right. I'm very high on Michael Bunting as well. You referenced it yourself. He had a very seamless, easy fit with Evgeny Malkin, and we know how difficult that can be with Gino. And I think a full 82 with Evgeny Malkin, or let's say a full 75 to 82 games with him, because of Michael Bunting's style of play, I would not be shocked if he gets some bumps and bruises throughout the year. And I say it about players like Michael Bunting. The ability to play with talent is a skill. The ability to fill in with elite talents is a skill within itself, and he certainly has that. He's shown it in Toronto. He's showing it here in Pittsburgh. I am very high on him, and you beat me to it there at the end of your comments. I think a bounce back is in order for Rickard Rakell. Now, again, don't love the contract. If they could move it, I would take that deal almost sight unseen.
Yeah, if they were to move it, I would not be upset about it, just because that contract is for a while.
Bit of an asterisk on it, because I would like to see what they move him for. I know how precious of a commodity cap space is, but you still would have a gigantic hole on your right side if you move Rickard Rakell. But I think last year it was a snowball that turned into an avalanche for him. He was hurt early on. He was unable to really bounce back after the injury. He didn't actually ever really fully recover from the injury as well. So it was just a spiral for him of all things going wrong throughout the entirety of the season. So if he's healthy and back, I think he's going to have a better year than we expect. And Bryan Rust is Bryan Rust. I mean, that man is Mr. Consistency. We know what we're going to get from him. He's going to be the Swiss Army knife, I continue to call him. He's going to be great on Crosby's wing. He'll be able to fill in on the power play and the penalty kill and be able to play in high leverage moments, because that's just the kind of player he's turned into. But yeah, my biggest player to watch in the top six is right there with you, and it's Michael Bunting, quickly followed by Rickard Rakell. I think he could have a big bounce back year because all the tools are there for him. We've seen him do it before. And like I said, last year, just domino effect that hurt him all season long.
Yeah, and I think in terms of Rakell, man, I really think we could see him get some power play time this upcoming season. Maybe not on the top power play, but maybe on the second power play unit to get some more stats from him overall. I don't know if he's going to play at the level that we saw him play at a couple of seasons ago, where he was arguably their best winger after Jake Gensel. But I think if he can play at a level, where he's scoring again, 21, 22 goals, 50 points, I will take that. But as I said, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, if they were to get out of that contract and at least get, a decent return out of it or a trade that makes sense, I would not be mad about it. But to your point, it would create a hole in their lineup if they're not replacing him in that deal.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that'll do it for this episode, the Monday edition of the Locked On Penguins podcast. As always, we appreciate you tuning in and listening to us give our thoughts on this hockey franchise. But for Hunter Hodes, I am Patrick Damp. Thank you as always for tuning in. We'll be back with a fresh episode for you on Tuesday.